World War I is remembered through the lens of poetry, mud, and sacrifice. The image most people carry is one of tragic nobility, men trapped in trenches enduring horrors beyond imagination, but maintaining something resembling honor. That version of the war has been polished by a century of retrospective storytelling. What it conceals is far more unsettling. The Great War was not a sudden descent into chaos. It was the slow bureaucratization of human destruction, a conflict where the most brutal practices were not anomalies but systems, repeated so often they stopped registering as cruelty. These were not war crimes in the traditional sense. They were procedures, carried out with forms in triplicate and medical terminology that made suffering sound like logistics. What follows is not a list of atrocities. It is a catalogue of the routine. The first practice that became mundane was the deliberate use of men as bait. In the opening months of the war, commanders on all sides quickly realized that direct assaults across open ground resulted in predictable slaughter. By 1915, this was no longer a miscalculation. It was a tactic. Battalions were sent over the top, knowing they would be annihilated, not because generals believed in breakthrough, but because the act of dying drew enemy fire and revealed machine gun positions. The men were reconnaissance instruments. They knew it. Orders were phrased with clinical detachment. Attack at dawn, advance 200 yards, expected casualties 70%. The survivors would report back on where the fire had come from. This was called probing. It happened daily on both sides of the line. No one protested because protest implied the system could be questioned. It could not. The men climbed out of the trenches because the alternative was execution for cowardice. The officers who gave the orders filed reports using passive voice. Positions were tested. Information was obtained. Losses were within projected parameters. There was no language in the military vocabulary to describe what was actually happening. Soldiers were being converted into data. Medical officers documented this, but their reports were suppressed. A British Army surgeon named Harold Dearden kept detailed notes during his posting near Ypres in 1916. He recorded that wounded men were sometimes left in no man's land deliberately because their screaming attracted stretcher-bearers who could then be targeted by snipers. This was not German brutality. Both sides did it. Dearden wrote that the practice became so normalized that officers would discuss it openly at mess, referring to the voices in the dark as useful distractions. His journals were classified until 1974. When they were finally released, they were edited. The sections describing the use of wounded men as bait were removed from the public edition. They remain in the restricted archive at the Imperial War Museum. The justification given was that such details might harm the dignity of veterans. What it actually protected was the image of command structure as rational. The second routine practice was punitive wounding of your own men. Execution for cowardice or desertion is well documented. Less discussed is the widespread use of deliberate maiming as punishment for minor infractions. In the French army, men who were deemed to have self-inflicted wounds were sometimes subjected to what was called corrective surgery. This involved military doctors reopening wounds without anesthetic or inflicting matching injuries to the opposite limb to ensure symmetry of damage. The logic was deterrence. A man who shot himself in the foot to escape combat would have the other foot wounded to prevent rumors that he had gotten away with it. This was codified in internal French military medical guidelines from late 1915. The orders were verbal to avoid written records, but testimony from surviving medical orderlies confirms the practice continued until 1917. German forces used a different method. Soldiers caught feigning illness or inflicting minor wounds were assigned to punishment battalions that were sent into no man's land to clear barbed wire under fire without weapons. Survival rate was under 10%. This was considered lenient compared to execution. The men were given a chance. The fact that the chance was statistically void did not appear in the paperwork. Deliberate infection was another tool. In multiple accounts from British and Commonwealth forces, men hospitalized for self-inflicted wounds reported that their bandages were changed infrequently and non-sterile dressings were used. Some medical staff admitted decades later that this was intentional. The goal was to ensure that any man who escaped the front through self-harm would suffer enough in hospital to deter others. Gangrene and sepsis became forms of administrative punishment. No orders exist because none were needed. The culture of the medical corps adapted to the priorities of command. Keeping men combat ready meant ensuring that escape through injury was undesirable. A 1916 British medical memo, declassified in 2003, discusses infection rates in suspected self-inflicted wound cases and notes that higher infection corresponds with lower repeat rates. The language is statistical. The implication is clear. The third practice involved the systematic use of shell shock cases as labor units. By 1916, psychiatric casualties outnumbered physical wounds in some sectors. The term shell shock was itself a bureaucratic compromise. It implied a temporary condition caused by proximity to explosions. In reality, most cases were psychological collapse from prolonged stress, lack of sleep, and exposure to mass death. The military could not admit this because it suggested the war itself was unbearable. Instead, shell shock was classified as a functional disorder. Men were not broken by war. They were malfunctioning. Those diagnosed were divided into categories. The ones who could still walk and follow simple orders were assigned to labor battalions behind the lines. They dug latrines, moved ammunition, cleared corpses. The work was often more dangerous than frontline service because they were unprotected and considered expendable. A Canadian medical report from 1917 describes a labor unit composed entirely of shell shock cases working under German artillery fire near Passchendaele. 40 men were killed in one afternoon. The report notes this as wastage, but does not recommend removing psychiatric patients from hazardous duty. The conclusion is that their labor value outweighs their survival. This was policy. It continued until the armistice. Men who could not work were sent to specialized hospitals where treatment often resembled torture. Electroshock therapy was used not to heal, but to punish symptoms. British neurologist Lewis Yelland pioneered a method involving electrical current applied to the throat of mute patients while shouting at them to speak. Sessions lasted hours. The goal was not recovery, but the restoration of function. A man who could talk could return to duty. Yelland published his methods in 1918, and they were celebrated as breakthroughs. His case notes describe patients screaming, convulsing, begging for the treatment to stop. He continued until they spoke. He considered this compassionate because the alternative was lifelong silence. Other doctors used starvation, solitary confinement, and forced exposure to loud noises to desensitize patients. These methods were standard across French, British, and German medical networks. After the war, many of these doctors received honors for their contributions to psychiatry. The patients they treated were rarely followed up. Suicide rates among diagnosed shell shock cases in the 1920s were never comprehensively studied. Informal estimates suggest more than half did not survive the decade. The fourth practice was using gas, not for tactical advantage, but for area denial and terror maintenance. Chlorine and phosgene were introduced as weapons of breakthrough. They failed. By 1917, gas was deployed primarily to contaminate rear areas, supply lines, and rest zones. The goal was not to kill, but to ensure soldiers never felt safe. Gas shells were fired into villages behind the lines where troops were billeted. The contamination lingered for days. Men could not eat, sleep, or remove their masks. Constant low-level exposure caused chronic respiratory damage that did not incapacitate immediately but degraded endurance over months. This was intentional. German chemical warfare planners explicitly stated that the goal was cumulative harm. A document from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, dated January 1917, discusses the strategic value of sublethal dosing. The term used is progressive attrition. Soldiers would weaken gradually and require more medical resources, straining enemy logistics. The same logic appeared in British and French planning documents. Gas was efficient not because it killed, but because it eroded. Mustard gas was particularly valued for this reason. It caused delayed blistering, often hours after exposure. Men would be contaminated without knowing it, then develop severe chemical burns overnight. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers became terrified of invisible threats. Some refused to sleep, others compulsively washed, scraping their skin raw. Medical officers noted that mustard gas casualties often developed behavioral changes indistinguishable from psychiatric disorders. This was not a side effect. It was the weapon functioning as designed. A French military chemist named Victor Grinard wrote in his personal correspondence that mustard gas was intended to create a state of perpetual anxiety. His letters were donated to a university archive in 1968 and remain largely unexamined by historians. The few scholars who have reviewed them describe his tone as detached, even enthusiastic. He refers to exposed soldiers as test populations and discusses optimal dispersal patterns for maximum psychological yield. He won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1912 for unrelated work. His contributions to gas warfare were omitted from his official biography. The fifth routine practice involved deliberate contamination of water supplies in contested zones. Both sides poisoned wells, streams, and irrigation channels in areas they expected to abandon. The goal was not immediate, but delayed harm. Troops advancing into recaptured territory would use the water, sicken, and require evacuation. This reduced combat effectiveness without firing a shot. Dysentery and typhoid became weapons. Military manuals from both German and Allied forces include instructions for chemical treatment of water sources to render them unsafe. The language is bureaucratic. Ensure denial of hydration resources to enemy forces. In practice, this meant dumping arsenic, fecal matter, and decomposing animal carcasses into wells. The contamination spread to civilian populations. Entire villages in northeastern France and Belgium experienced mass die-offs from waterborne illness in 1917 and 1918. These were attributed to wartime hardship. Medical investigators later confirmed deliberate poisoning, but the findings were classified. Releasing them would have violated international agreements signed after the war. The documents were sealed under national security designations and remain restricted in Belgian and French military archives. Civilian populations in occupied zones were subjected to another routine practice, forced labor in combat zones. German forces in Belgium and northern France conscripted local men, women, and adolescents to dig trenches, build fortifications, and clear unexploded ordnance. This violated Hague Convention rules, but enforcement mechanisms did not exist. The workers were unpaid, underfed, and often placed directly in the line of fire. Mortality rates were not recorded systematically, but survivor testimony collected after the war suggests that in some areas, up to 30% of conscripted civilians died within 6 months. The German military government classified these workers as voluntary labor, a designation that allowed the practice to continue without official acknowledgement of coercion. Belgian resistance groups documented names and deaths, compiling lists that were smuggled to neutral countries. These records were presented at post-war tribunals, but were deemed inadmissible because the German government argued that no written orders for forced labor existed. The absence of documentation became proof of innocence. The practice continued until the retreat of 1918. After the armistice, mass graves were discovered near former German logistics hubs. Forensic analysis in the 1920s identified remains of civilians showing signs of malnutrition and unhealed fractures consistent with heavy labor. The findings were published in Belgian medical journals, but not widely circulated. By then, reconstruction efforts prioritized reconciliation over accountability. The sixth practice was the routine use of prisoners of war as minesweepers. Captured soldiers were forced to walk ahead of advancing troops through suspected mined areas. This occurred on all fronts, but was most extensively documented on the Eastern Front and in the Italian theater. Russian forces used Austrian prisoners. Italians used captured Austrians and Hungarians. Germans used Russian and Romanian prisoners. The justification was that prisoners had no strategic value and their loss did not affect combat strength. A 1916 Austrian military memo discusses the efficiency of using prisoners to clear paths through defensive zones. The memo calculates that the cost of losing 10 prisoners is less than the cost of losing one trained sapper. The logic was economic. Human value was measured in replacement cost. Survivors of prisoner camps reported that men selected for mine clearing were told they were being transferred to labor details. They were marched into mined fields and ordered forward. Those who refused were shot. Those who complied usually detonated mines within minutes. The practice was so common that prisoners developed a dark routine of their own. Men chosen for mine duty would sometimes deliberately step on mines immediately to avoid prolonged terror. Camp guards noted this behavior in reports and recommended spreading out prisoners to prevent mass simultaneous detonations, which reduced the clearing efficiency. The recommendation was implemented. Prisoners were spaced at intervals to ensure mines were triggered individually. Medical experimentation on prisoners and detained soldiers was another normalized practice. Military doctors on all sides used captive populations to test experimental treatments, study disease progression, and develop new surgical techniques. Consent was not sought because prisoners were considered state property. A German military hospital near Königsberg conducted experimental bone grafts on Russian prisoners in 1916. The procedures were not intended to heal. They were practice surgeries for techniques that might later be used on German soldiers. Survival of the test subjects was irrelevant. Records indicate that of 68 surgeries performed, 51 prisoners died from infection or surgical complications. The data was used to refine methods. By late 1917, the mortality rate for the same procedures performed on German soldiers had dropped to 12%. This was considered a successful research program. Similar experiments were conducted by French doctors testing blood transfusion methods on German prisoners, and by British medical staff studying the progression of untreated gas gangrene in Turkish captives. The ethical framework did not exist to classify this as abuse. Prisoners were resources. Their use in medical research was efficient. After the war, some of the techniques developed through these experiments became standard practice in civilian medicine. The origins were not discussed. The seventh routine practice involved the systematic looting of corpses by your own side. Battlefield salvage was official policy. After engagements, designated units would move through the dead, stripping bodies of usable equipment, clothing, and personal items. This was not grave robbing in the criminal sense. It was supply chain management. A British Army order from 1915 specifies that all boots, coats, and metal items are to be recovered from battlefield dead and returned to quartermasters for redistribution. The order includes the dead of both sides. German corpses were stripped just as thoroughly as British. The practice was so routine that specialized salvage companies operated behind the lines, employing civilian workers to process recovered materials. Clothing was washed or burned, depending on condition. Usable items were reissued. A soldier killed in April might have his boots on another man's feet by May. No one questioned this. Resources were scarce. The dead had no need. Problems arose when personal effects were also taken. Soldiers recovering bodies frequently pocketed watches, rings, and letters. This was officially prohibited, but universally practiced. Officers looked the other way because they did the same. The result was that families receiving bodies for burial often found them stripped of anything valuable. Complaints were filed. Military authorities responded with circulars reminding troops that theft from the dead was unbecoming. Enforcement was non-existent. A French parliamentary inquiry in 1918 investigated widespread reports of soldiers' bodies returned without wedding rings or identity discs. The inquiry concluded that losses were due to battlefield conditions, not theft. No disciplinary actions were recommended. The practice continued unabated. The dead were also used as construction material. In waterlogged sectors, particularly around Ypres and Passchendaele, the ground was too soft to hold trenches. Duckboards and sandbags sank. Engineers discovered that corpses, when placed in layers and covered with soil, provided stable foundations. This was not official policy, but it was widespread. Trench walls in some sectors were reinforced with the dead. Bodies were stacked and compacted. Fresh earth was layered on top. The smell was overwhelming, but the structure held. Soldiers walking through these trenches reported that body parts would sometimes emerge from the walls after heavy rain. Hands, boots, sometimes entire heads. These were pushed back in or hacked off and thrown into the mud. No one reported it because everyone knew. After the war, reconstruction crews found entire trenches where the support structures were human remains. These areas were marked and avoided during rebuilding. No memorials were placed. The ground was simply left undisturbed. Some of these sites remain today, unmarked fields where the soil is unusually rich. The eighth practice was the use of summary execution as a command tool to maintain discipline during retreats or failed assaults. When units broke under fire, officers were authorized to shoot men who fled. This is generally known. What is less discussed is that these executions were often carried out against men who had not fled, but simply stopped advancing. A British court-martial record from 1917 describes a private executed for cowardice after he took cover behind a destroyed tank during an assault. He had not retreated. He had not disobeyed. He simply stopped moving forward. His officer shot him in the head and filed a report stating that the man refused orders. The court-martial was a formality. The execution was upheld. This was not an isolated incident. French military records contain hundreds of similar cases. The German army used a more efficient method. Officers were issued pistols specifically for maintaining discipline. They were instructed to shoot any man who hesitated during an assault. This was called leadership by example. The bodies were left where they fell. Other soldiers would see and understand. After battles, these executions were not recorded separately from combat deaths. The official casualty figures include men killed by their own officers. The numbers are unknowable, but conservative estimates suggest thousands died this way on all sides. No post-war accountability process addressed this. The executions were legal under military law. The law did not change. Rape as a systematic practice is difficult to document because military records do not preserve evidence of crimes committed against enemy civilians. However, survivor testimony, ecclesiastical records, and post-war investigations provide fragmentation evidence. In occupied Belgium and France, German soldiers engaged in widespread sexual violence against civilian women. This was not official policy, but it was tolerated. A Belgian government commission established in 1919 collected testimony from over 2,000 women describing assaults by occupying forces. The commission's report was suppressed by the Belgian government on the grounds that publication would harm national dignity and discourage women from returning to normal life. The report was classified and remained sealed until 2001. Its findings describe systematic assault in villages near military installations, with some women reporting repeated attacks over months or years. German military police were aware but did not intervene unless the victim was related to someone of strategic importance. The same pattern occurred on the Eastern Front, where Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian forces all committed mass sexual violence in occupied territories. These crimes were not prosecuted. After the war, the focus was on rebuilding, not justice. Women who reported assaults were often blamed for collaboration. Many never spoke of what happened. Their stories exist only in fragmentary mentions in church records, where priests documented confessions or requests for aid. Historians examining these records in recent decades have constructed partial accounts, but the full scope remains unknown. The practice was routine because it was invisible. The ninth practice was the deliberate targeting of medical personnel and hospital facilities. The Geneva Convention prohibited attacks on clearly marked medical units. In practice, medical stations were targeted regularly by all sides. The reasoning was tactical. Destroying enemy medical capability meant wounded soldiers could not be treated and returned to combat. A German artillery manual from 1916 includes instructions for identifying field hospitals by the presence of Red Cross flags and concentrating fire on those positions. The manual justifies this by noting that enemy medical stations are legitimate military targets if they support combat operations. The same logic appeared in French and British planning documents. Medical tents were shelled. Hospital trains were bombed. Ambulance convoys were strafed. Medical staff were killed in numbers disproportionate to their frontline presence. A British medical officer named John McCrae, who wrote the poem In Flanders Fields, was killed by German artillery fire that directly targeted his dressing station in 1918. His death was not unusual. Records from the Royal Army Medical Corps indicate that over 3,000 medical personnel were killed by enemy fire during the war, the majority in clearly marked non-combat zones. Protests were filed through neutral countries. Germany accused the Allies of the same practice. Evidence supported both claims. The targeting continued because it worked. Armies with degraded medical infrastructure lost effectiveness. Humanitarian concerns were irrelevant. The 10th routine practice was using starvation as a strategic tool against both military and civilian populations. The British naval blockade of Germany is well known. Less discussed is the deliberate starvation policies implemented within occupied zones and besieged cities. German forces occupying parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans requisitioned food supplies far beyond military need, creating artificial famines. In Serbia, occupied Romania, and parts of Ukraine, civilian death rates from starvation exceeded combat deaths in some regions. This was not accidental. A German logistics report from 1917 discusses food requisition quotas designed to extract maximum calories while maintaining civilian populations just above starvation threshold. The calculation was explicit. Too much extraction would cause population collapse and rebellion. Too little would leave resources for enemy use. The optimal level was chronic malnutrition. Populations would be weakened, compliant, and unable to support resistance. The policy was implemented across occupied zones. Death rates among children and the elderly spiked. These deaths were attributed to war hardship, not policy. After the war, relief agencies estimated that over 500,000 civilians in occupied Eastern Europe died from hunger-related causes directly linked to requisition policies. The German government denied intentional starvation. The evidence was documentary. The policies remained. Civilian labor extraction in occupied zones also involved children. German authorities in Belgium and occupied France conscripted boys as young as 12 to work in factories and agriculture. The justification was labor shortage. The reality was exploitation. Children worked 12-hour shifts in munitions plants, often without safety equipment. Accident rates were high. A Belgian resistance report from 1917 describes a factory near Liège where 43 children under 15 died in industrial accidents over an 8-month period. The factory continued operating. The children were replaced. After the war, survivors testified that they had been forced to work under threat of family deportation. German authorities responded that labor assignments were voluntary and that families had agreed in exchange for food rations. No written records of these agreements existed. The testimony was dismissed. No reparations were provided. Many of the child laborers suffered permanent injuries or respiratory damage from chemical exposure. Their post-war lives were marked by chronic illness. They were not classified as war victims because they had not been combatants. The 11th practice was the routine use of flamethrowers, not as siege weapons, but as tools of trench clearing designed to maximize suffering. Flamethrowers were introduced by German forces in 1915 and quickly adopted by all sides. The official purpose was to clear fortified positions. The actual use was psychological destruction. Flamethrower attacks were not aimed at killing efficiently. They were designed to cause terror. Burning men alive creates panic that spreads faster than fire. Troops facing flamethrower assault often broke and ran, not because the weapon was tactically superior, but because the manner of death was unbearable. Military planners understood this. Training manuals emphasized the demoralizing effect. A British manual from 1917 states that flamethrowers should be used in surprise attacks to create maximum psychological impact. The goal was not territorial gain, but mental collapse. Survivors of flamethrower attacks reported that the screams of burning men haunted them more than any other combat experience. Some developed acute phobic responses to fire. These men were often diagnosed with shell shock and treated accordingly. The connection between flamethrower exposure and psychiatric breakdown was noted in medical literature but not acted upon. The weapons continued in use because they worked. Burn injuries from flamethrowers were particularly difficult to treat, and survival rates were low. Men caught in flame attacks who did not die immediately often suffered for days. Medical staff had limited means to treat severe burns. Morphine was rationed. Many burn victims were left with minimal pain relief, their injuries dressed with whatever was available. Infection was near universal. A French medical report from Verdun describes a field hospital that received 37 flamethrower casualties over a 2-week period. 34 died, most within 72 hours. The 3 survivors were so severely disfigured that they were transferred to specialized facilities and never returned to public life. The report recommends that flamethrower casualties be classified as expectant, meaning they should receive minimal treatment to conserve resources for soldiers with better survival odds. This recommendation was adopted. Men burned by flamethrowers were often given morphine and left to die. This was considered humane. The 12th practice was the widespread use of collective punishment against civilian populations suspected of aiding resistance or sabotage. When railways were damaged, bridges destroyed, or supply convoys attacked, occupying forces would retaliate against nearby villages. The methods were systematic. Villages were burned. Hostages were taken and executed. Entire populations were deported. A German military order from occupied Belgium in 1914 states that for every act of sabotage, 10 civilians will be shot and the responsible village will be destroyed. The order was carried out repeatedly. In the town of Dinant, over 600 civilians were executed in August 1914 in reprisal for alleged sniper fire. Most of the dead were women, children, and elderly. No evidence of organized resistance was found. The German command justified the action as preventive. The message was clear. Resistance would result in annihilation. Similar policies were implemented by Austro-Hungarian forces in Serbia and by Russian forces in East Prussia. Collective punishment was not an excess of war. It was governance. After the war, these actions were investigated but rarely prosecuted. The defense was military necessity. The argument was that harsh measures prevented greater loss of life by discouraging resistance. Tribunals accepted this logic in most cases. A few symbolic convictions were obtained, but sentences were light and often commuted. The practice itself was never condemned as inherently criminal. Deportation of entire populations was another routine measure. In 1916, German authorities deported over 60,000 Belgian civilians to Germany for forced labor. The deportations were conducted in railway cars, often without food or water in winter. Hundreds died in transit. Those who survived were assigned to factories, mines, and farms. Conditions were brutal. A post-war Belgian government investigation found that approximately 7,000 of the deported workers died in Germany from illness, malnutrition, or industrial accidents. The German government initially denied the deportations, then admitted them, but claimed the workers were volunteers. Documentary evidence showed deportation orders signed by military governors. The orders used the term voluntary resettlement. Testimony from deportees described being rounded up at gunpoint. The contradiction was not resolved. After the war, survivors were returned to Belgium but received no compensation. Many were shunned in their communities, suspected of collaboration because they had worked for Germany. The trauma was double. They had been enslaved and then blamed. The 13th practice was the deliberate use of disease as a weapon through the strategic neglect of sanitation and medical care in prison camps. Prisoner mortality rates varied wildly depending on nationality and location, but certain patterns suggest intentional neglect. Russian prisoners in German camps died at rates exceeding 30% in some facilities. German prisoners in Russian camps fared similarly. The causes were typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation. These conditions were preventable. Camp commandants had access to medical supplies and sanitation infrastructure. The resources were allocated elsewhere. A German army medical inspector's report from 1916 describes conditions in a Russian prisoner camp near Hameln. The inspector notes severe overcrowding, lack of latrines, contaminated water, and inadequate food. He recommends improvements. His recommendations are ignored. A follow-up report 6 months later notes that mortality has increased. He again recommends action. Again, nothing changes. The pattern repeats across multiple camps. The conclusion is unavoidable. The deaths were acceptable. Prisoners were a logistical burden. High mortality reduced that burden. No orders explicitly stated this. None needed to. The system functioned without written intent. Allied camps were no better. A British camp in Egypt holding Turkish prisoners experienced cholera outbreaks in 1916. Medical officers requested quarantine facilities and additional medical staff. The requests were denied due to resource constraints. The outbreak killed over 800 prisoners in 3 months. A military inquiry found no negligence. The deaths were attributed to wartime scarcity. No one was held accountable. The camp continued operating. French camps holding German prisoners in North Africa had similar mortality rates from disease. The deaths were recorded, but not investigated. After the war, the Red Cross compiled mortality statistics for prisoner camps across all belligerents. The report was confidential. It showed that approximately 8% of all prisoners of war died in captivity, the vast majority from preventable disease. The report was not published. Governments argued that releasing the figures would inflame public opinion and hinder peace negotiations. The data remained classified until the 1960s. By then, most of the dead had been forgotten. The 14th practice was the routine execution of wounded enemy soldiers on the battlefield. Taking prisoners required resources. Guarding, feeding, and transporting captives strained logistics. In fluid combat situations, wounded enemies were often killed rather than captured. This was unofficial but widespread. Soldiers on all sides reported shooting wounded opponents as standard practice. A German infantryman's diary recovered after the war describes an engagement near Arras, where his unit overran a British position. Wounded British soldiers were found in shell holes. The diary states they were shot where they lay because we had no means to carry them and could not leave them behind us. This was not cruelty, it was efficiency. The same logic appears in accounts from British, French, and American soldiers. Wounded enemies were threats or burdens. Either way, they were eliminated. Officers did not order this explicitly. They did not need to. The practice emerged from the conditions. After the war, veterans who described these actions faced no legal consequences. What they had done was understood, even if unspoken. The silence was collective. Mercy killings of your own wounded were also routine. When men were too badly injured to move and evacuation was impossible, they were sometimes shot by their comrades or officers. This was framed as compassion. A soldier with abdominal wounds or shattered limbs faced hours or days of agony before death. A bullet was quicker. Letters and diaries mention this with disturbing frequency. A British officer wrote to his sister in 1917, describing a decision to shoot 3 of his own men who were dying slowly in no man's land. He wrote that it was the kindest thing he had ever done, and the worst. No one challenged these decisions. They were not recorded in official reports. The dead were listed as killed in action. The method was irrelevant. Some soldiers refused to participate in mercy killings and were not forced. Others volunteered. The psychological cost was borne privately. After the war, many men who had killed their own comrades out of mercy struggled with guilt. There were no support systems. They carried it alone. The 15th practice was the systematic destruction of cultural and historical sites for strategic denial. Libraries, museums, churches, and universities were targeted not out of hatred, but to demoralize populations and erase identity. The German shelling of Reims Cathedral in 1914 was framed as a response to French use of the cathedral towers for observation. This was partially true. It was also true that the cathedral was a symbol of French heritage. Its destruction had psychological impact beyond military value. The same logic drove the burning of the library at Louvain, which held medieval manuscripts and irreplaceable texts. German forces claimed the library was destroyed accidentally during street fighting. Witness testimony and forensic evidence suggest it was deliberately set afire. Over 300,000 volumes were lost. The cultural impact was incalculable. After the war, Germany offered to rebuild the library, but refused to admit intentional destruction. The offer was rejected. The loss remained. Allied forces engaged in similar destruction. British and French artillery targeted German castles, palaces, and historic towns when they served as military headquarters or observation points. The justification was always tactical. The result was cultural erasure. A French artillery officer's memoir describes shelling the medieval town of Cambrai in 1918. He noted that the town had no military significance, but was targeted to deny the Germans a rest area. The town burned for 3 days. Most of its historic center was destroyed. The officer expressed regret, but noted that war leaves no room for sentiment. After the armistice, reconstruction focused on modern infrastructure. Historic architecture was often not rebuilt. The war erased layers of history. This was understood as necessary cost. The 16th practice was the use of solitary confinement and sensory deprivation as punishment in military prisons. Soldiers convicted of infractions, particularly repeat deserters or those accused of mutiny, were held in conditions designed to break them psychologically. Cells were unlit, unheated, and silent. Food was minimal. Human contact was prohibited. A British military prison in France used solitary confinement cells measuring 6 feet by 4 feet with no windows. Men were held there for weeks or months. Medical officers reported that prolonged isolation caused hallucinations, self-harm, and complete psychological collapse. The punishment was considered effective. Men released from solitary were usually compliant. Some never recovered. A report from a French military psychiatrist in 1918 describes interviewing a soldier who had spent 4 months in isolation for desertion. The man was unable to speak coherently. He exhibited signs of severe disassociation. The psychiatrist recommended transfer to a mental institution. The recommendation was denied. The man was returned to duty. He deserted again within days and was executed. The psychiatrist noted this in his records, but drew no conclusions. German military prisons used similar methods. A facility near Cologne held soldiers in underground cells with no light and minimal ventilation. Prisoners reported losing track of time and experiencing complete sensory deprivation. Some were held in these conditions for over a year. After the war, the facility was inspected by Allied investigators. They found evidence of systematic abuse, including starvation rations, lack of sanitation, and indications of torture. The German authorities argued that the prison was a standard military disciplinary facility and that conditions met wartime norms. No prosecutions resulted. The prison was dismantled and the records were destroyed. The 17th practice was the forced recruitment of colonial subjects and their use as expendable frontline troops. France recruited hundreds of thousands of soldiers from its African colonies. Britain drew heavily from India, Africa, and the Caribbean. These men were promised pay, pensions, and respect. They received minimal training and were often assigned to the most dangerous sectors. Casualty rates among colonial troops were significantly higher than among European soldiers. This was not coincidence. Colonial units were used for assaults where losses were expected to be catastrophic. A French military planning document from 1916 discusses the use of Senegalese troops in an upcoming offensive. The document states that Senegalese units are suited for shock attacks due to their aggressive nature and that expected losses of 50 to 60% are acceptable given recruitment capacity in the colonies. The language is eugenic and utilitarian. The men are described as resources, renewable through colonial conscription. Over 200,000 colonial soldiers serving France died during the war. Their service was largely forgotten in post-war commemorations. Memorials in Paris list French dead. Colonial soldiers are recorded separately, if at all. Indian troops serving Britain faced similar treatment. They were deployed to the Western Front, Mesopotamia, and East Africa, often without adequate winter clothing or appropriate equipment. Thousands died from exposure and disease that could have been prevented. A British medical officer stationed with an Indian unit in France wrote in his diary that the men were suffering from frostbite and respiratory infections because they lacked proper coats. He requisitioned supplies. The request was denied. He wrote that the men are dying from cold and we are doing nothing. The entry ends there. After the war, India sought recognition for its contributions. Over 1 million Indian soldiers had served. Approximately 74,000 died. Britain offered limited pensions and symbolic honors. The demand for political autonomy was rejected. The message was clear. Service did not equal status. Colonial soldiers had been useful. They remained subjects. The 18th practice was the use of false surrenders and feigned retreats as tactical deception, leading to widespread distrust and the killing of actual surrendering soldiers. Both sides used fake surrenders to lure enemies into ambushes. German units would raise white flags, wait for Allied soldiers to approach, then open fire. Allied forces did the same. The tactic worked once or twice. After that, white flags were ignored. Soldiers attempting genuine surrender were shot because accepting surrender was too risky. A British corporal's account from 1917 describes an incident where German soldiers emerged from a trench waving white cloths. His unit opened fire immediately. Some of the Germans were unarmed. It did not matter. The corporal wrote that we could not trust them and we could not take chances. Similar accounts exist from all armies. The practice of killing surrendering soldiers became normalized. It was safer than the alternative. After the war, this behavior was not prosecuted because both sides were equally guilty. The laws of war prohibit killing those who surrender. The laws assume surrender is recognizable. In the trenches, it was not. Espionage and summary execution of suspected spies or saboteurs became another routine practice, often based on minimal evidence. Civilians caught near military zones were frequently accused of espionage. The standards of proof were non-existent. A Belgian farmer found with a pair of binoculars could be shot as a spy. A French woman writing a letter in German could be executed for collaboration. Military tribunals processing these cases often lasted minutes. A British court-martial record from 1915 shows the trial of a Belgian civilian accused of signaling German positions with a lantern. The evidence was testimony from a single soldier. The trial lasted 11 minutes. The civilian was executed the same day. No appeals process existed. After the war, investigations into wrongful executions found hundreds of cases where evidence was circumstantial or fabricated. No reparations were paid. The executions had been legal under martial law. The law had not required actual guilt, only suspicion. The 19th and final practice that became routine was the bureaucratic processing of mass death with language designed to obscure human cost. Casualty reports used terms like wastage, attrition, losses, and depreciation. Men were inventory. Their deaths were accounting problems. A British General Staff report from the Somme offensive calculates acceptable loss ratios needed to achieve breakthrough. The numbers are discussed like production quotas. 60,000 casualties are acceptable if enemy losses exceed 100,000. The math is cold. The men are absent. This language permeated every level of command. Orders did not say, send men to die. They said, commit reserves or execute assault. The result was the same, but the words created distance. Generals who never saw the front could issue orders that killed thousands because the orders were phrased as strategic necessities, not death sentences. After major offensives, casualty figures were adjusted to manage public perception. Losses were underreported or spread across weeks to avoid shocking headlines. A French government memo from 1917 discusses the political necessity of limiting daily casualty announcements to fewer than 5,000 to prevent panic. Actual losses during the Nivelle offensive exceeded that number many times over. The figures were parceled out slowly. Families received telegrams over months. The full scale was never announced. This was not secrecy. It was communications management. The public could not handle the truth in aggregate. It had to be delivered in doses. By the final year of the war, death had become so routine that its documentation was streamlined. Standardized forms, carbon copies, processed in batches. A soldier killed in action generated paperwork that moved through channels with mechanical efficiency. Notification, retrieval of effects, burial or disposal, update to regimental records, pension processing. Each step was assigned to clerks who handled thousands of cases. The system was efficient. It was also numbing. The people processing the paperwork stopped seeing individuals. They saw case numbers. This was necessary. To process industrial-scale death required industrial-scale detachment. The war ended on the 11th of November 1918. Approximately 20 million people had died. The number is an estimate because exact counts were impossible. Millions of bodies were never recovered. Millions more were unidentified. The scale was beyond comprehension, so it was converted into statistics and memorials. The practices that had become routine during the war, the use of men as bait, the deliberate infection of wounds, the targeting of medical staff, the starvation of civilians, the execution of the wounded, the bureaucratic language of mass death. These did not end because they were recognized as wrong. They ended because the war ended. No institutional reckoning occurred. The systems that had enabled industrial killing were examined for tactical lessons, not moral ones. Military academies studied logistics and communications. They did not study why it had been acceptable to calculate human loss as a variable in strategic equations. In the decades after, veterans rarely spoke of what had been routine. The silence was not shame, it was incomprehension. How could they explain that the worst aspects of the war had not been chaotic brutality, but organized procedure? The forms in triplicate, the medical terminology for torture, the polite language in orders that sent thousands to pointless death. These things had no dramatic retelling. They were boring. Bureaucracy is always boring. That is how it persists. The Great War demonstrated that human beings could be destroyed on an industrial scale, not through hatred, but through systems. The systems required clerks, doctors, engineers, and officers who were not monsters. They were professionals. They did their jobs. The jobs required the conversion of people into materials. This conversion was so total that it became invisible. A century later, the war is remembered for its poetry and its mud. The administrative apparatus that made it function is forgotten. That apparatus never went away. It was refined.